Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Taglo Visesa, and I'll be in the background answering any of your technical questions today. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief overview of your webinar concept. To ask a question, go to the Q&A panel at the lower right side of your screen, type your question, select All Panelists from the drop-down menu, then click Send. If you do not see the Q&A panel, go to the bottom right of your screen, select the icons with the three dots, then choose Q&A. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the session. To preserve confidentiality, questions will be read by our team and will not be attributed to you. We will do our best to get all the questions during the Q&A portion of the briefing. But if you are not able to get an answer for you today, we will follow up via email. If you experience any technical difficulties during our session, please use the Q&A panel to request assistance. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Andrew.
Hello, everyone. It's Andrew Dugan, Associate Partner at Mckinsey's Dallas office in the Transportation, Logistics, and Infrastructure practice.
Julian.
Hello, this is Julian Wagendorf, an Associate Partner from the Berlin office. Exclusively work for transport and logistics players, mainly focusing on e-commerce logistics in the post and parcel industry and leading the workforce management service line globally. Very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Without further ado, I would like to introduce our host, moderator, and speaker, Megan.
Hey everyone, this is Megan Larkham. I'm a Junior Engagement Manager out of McKinsey's Boston office, and I'll be moderating our panel today. We'll cover three topics today: why workforce management matters, specific case studies for what we've seen done to optimize workforce management, and finally, thought starters for how you can think about workforce management in your organization. I'll ask that folks submit Q&A questions throughout the presentation. I will aggregate them and field them to our speakers at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Julian.
Okay, then let's kick it off and talk about why workforce management is relevant. And first, let's start what we mean by workforce management. If you look on the left-hand side of this slide, there are typically three elements of workforce strategy that we see. The one is really the future of work. So really this long-term perspective, how you plan your workforce in terms of like how is this impacted by technology, if autonomous trucking really takes off, what type of job profiles you need in the future, and how many do you really need if maybe warehousing and sorting centers are completely automated end-to-end, or maybe in the support functions, everything is done by robotics. So really this question about how does in the long term, the future of work, how does the model change? What is the supply side, but also what is the demand side? This is the one question. When you go to the bottom on the left-hand side is the network planning. It's not directly a workforce management question, but given in transport and logistics, labor is one of the key sources. If you make decisions about optimizing the flow of transport or optimizing the footprint, this will have a big impact on the allocation of the workforce. And therefore, this is the second question. What we really mean today, or is the focus of our discussion, is the middle one, is workforce management in the sense of medium and short-term perspective in optimizing the end-to-end perspective of demand and supply. So if you go to the right-hand side, the end-to-end cycle starts with really forecasting what is the demand of workforce that you need. In the second step, to think through what capacity in terms of labor you need to deliver it. And then in the third step, thinking through how can I retain the labor that I have and how can I incentivize them. And the fourth step is really how do you in the very short term schedule and control resources to deliver service levels and control costs. And then the last step is really about the day of operation. How do I make short-term decisions? How do I manage performance? And then the two enablers that you see at the bottom, really the tools and systems that enable you to optimize. And secondly, the review and track performance to drive excellence along this continuous cycle. This is what we mean by workforce management, focusing really on the front line, so blue-collar workers rather than white-collar, where we think is the most value for transport and logistics companies. When we go to the next page, the question is, what is the value of workforce management? And we think there's a triple impact in terms of customers, employees, and investors. When you match like the demand and the workforce that you have to deliver the services, it can have a significant impact on service levels. One case with an airline, we saw a 20% reduction in airline check-in waiting times by really thinking through what is the hourly and minute demand, and at the same time structure the capacity in this way that you always have the right people at the right time in the right place. Secondly, it also has impact on employees. Specifically, recently in the transport and logistics industry, absenteeism and attrition is getting more and more pressing. And the question is, how can you use HR analytics to really understand the drivers of absenteeism and attrition and develop countermeasures to have an impact and deal with this. And what we have seen with the trucking companies is 20% impact in terms of reducing attrition by using advanced analytics methods to approach it, which is getting even more important given that blue-collar workforce is getting more scarce. And lastly, on the right-hand side, it's really the impact on labor costs. And cost is the key driver in transport and logistics, and this obviously has an impact on investors. And I think the key thing here is really thinking in the end-to-end cycle from demand until day of operation and driving an efficiency there. If we go to the next page, the question is, what is the maturity of workforce management excellence along different industries? And we at Mckinsey clustered it into 4 buckets. On the left-hand side, you have the industries which are really still more Excel-based and unstructured and silo planning. Silo planning, we mean it does not combine the end-to-end steps in a holistic approach and cross-functional, and at the same time it works not across operations, commercial, and HR together, but it's very a siloed approach. We have seen this often in mining and shipping. It doesn't mean that all shipping companies are at this maturity. The next step to the right is really complex operation research, which is really heavily focusing on operation, having very advanced models to thinking about demand, but also supply, but being very heavily focused on the operations and not cross-functional, and using sometimes advanced analytics methods. This we have seen often in postal trucking in the manufacturing industry. If you then go further to the right, it's really about how can you start working more cross-functionally, starting with the commercial operation, HR, and finance team together, and applying advanced analytics, as we have seen in airlines, to really do near real-time reassignment of gates and use advanced analytics to do better forecasting. And then on the right-hand side, you see kind of this end-to-end integrated approach, which we have seen quite a bit in telcos and call centers, who really use automated disposition or advanced forecasting in 15-minute intervals with a very high accuracy of planning. And I think you can learn from different industry, different best practices, but at the same time, there's a caveat that obviously there are certain constraints in sense of network complexity or also type of workforce. So is it trip-based, like we see in trucking and in rail companies, or the stationary workforce, which we see in warehouse companies or postal companies and sorting centers. So this is quite important, but I think there are different maturities, and you can learn something from different industry, how to apply and drive workforce management excellence. If we go to the next page, the question is now how to get the value. On the left-hand side, we show some KPIs, why this is important, which I think is mostly agreed. So there's a big cost pressure in the transport logistics companies. A lot of incumbents have often 10 to 30% higher labor costs than the new attackers. Absenteeism, as I said already, is becoming more pressing and a bigger problem, and they are sometimes rates higher than 5 to 10%. And the soft factors in managing, especially the blue-collar workforce, is becoming more and more important, not only service levels, but also for driving cost excellence. Additionally, labor shortage is a big problem because having the right people at the right time in the blue-collar workforce is sometimes very difficult and very competitive. And therefore, you need new approaches to drive task. And then obviously there's due to e-commerce, there's a bigger imbalance in demand and supply. And at the same time, there are new automation opportunities. So the question is, how can you apply it to drive the end-to-end process? But to really get the value out of this, you see on the right-hand side, it is never kind of a standalone task, but it's very important to have a cross-functional team, and it needs to come from the top, and HR, the operations, CIO, and the commercial team needs to work together to really drive excellence here to get the most out of it. This is, from our experience, very important to move the needle and get to the next level. If you now go to the next page, the obvious question is, how has COVID now changed workforce management? And from our perspective, the answer is just accelerated the importance. You see on the left-hand side, demand fluctuation has even further accelerated. In the postal industry, we have seen plus 50 or 60% parcel volume during the lockdown. When we go to employee shortage, we have seen companies like Walmart and Amazon trying to hire more than 100,000 employees, given obviously the demand peak. And health and safety challenge is getting even more important because there's not only a capacity shortage, but obviously the new rules and requirements to ensure safety and healthy standards is even higher and more important. So it's important to be able to balance this, to be able to have enough capacity, but at the same time, look after health and safety of a very important asset of the companies, the employees. And lastly, on the right-hand side, the working model will change. Remote working is more and more the norm, and the question is, how does it look like in the new normal? Obviously, white collar and blue collar are quite different, but the question is really to think through, how can this be different? How do you define the impact on the workforce and driving excellence there? With this, I would like to hand over to Andrew to talk us through some case examples to bring this to life. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Julian. Absolutely. So on this page here, we see the 5-step continuous improvement cycle that was mentioned briefly in one of Julian's prior slides. There are 5 steps in the process we're going to talk through here in a little more detail, and then talk through case studies of a few of them. So first, going from long-term towards short-term, the first step is to forecast demand. Even before you get to workforce, you have to understand how much work is incoming that requires your workforce. That needs to be translated, of course, into a workload, often based on network flows for many travel and logistics players, and service level agreements. That can be a year out, but it can be even up within a week. Then is planning capacity, which is the headcount to meet that workload that's required. So even before you hire people, right, you have to understand, okay, what's our demand coming in, and what headcount capacity of what skills do we need to deliver that demand. Then once you know how much capacity you need and what skill sets and what roles, you need to, of course, get those people. So the third step is attracting, retaining resources and talent. And as Julian mentioned, the competition for skilled employees has been strong and is getting even stronger. So this is a crucial element that we'll talk a little bit more in detail in just a moment. Once you have your resources, then you have to schedule them. So shift creation, rostering, work rules, vacation scheduling, training, you name it, to satisfy all the requirements, but also to complete the required activities in a cost-effective way. And the last step, of course, is day of operations. Things are never exactly as planned, especially in frontline travel and logistics work. And so you have to be able to react to short-term changes like absenteeism, weather, unexpected spikes or troughs in demand, and reassign staff accordingly. This is a linked process from beginning to end, and the learnings in one stage will flow into what you do the next time around. It's also very cross-functional. And so as Julian mentioned in our first section of how workforce management affects all the members of the C-suite, this effort needs to include all of the different functions as well. Lastly, before we move on, I'll mention the note in the bottom left is that there are 2 cross-cutting enablers to make all of this work. The first is tools and systems that work together and are digitized using advanced analytics. And second is performance management, understanding how folks are performing, tracking it, improving that continuously as this process goes and we iterate from one time to the other is crucial to success. So Megan, if we can move to the next page, we'll start talking about case studies here. So if you recall, the first step in our process is forecasting demand. And this is an air cargo case study for that. The situation here is, of course, we had a large air cargo player who had limited visibility into their demand. They had done forecasting based on historicals, which is a fine place to start, but is highly inaccurate. Particularly in the COVID situation, their sales and revenue management teams were not satisfied with their backward-looking forecast because things were changing so rapidly, and they needed more visibility into their future volumes to set contracts as well as spot price guidance. So what was done here is using McKinsey's advanced analytics capabilities through Spark Beyond to identify a very large set of data sources to find predictive signals. And as you see here, there's 100+ data sources that were identified. Some of those are internal, but a great number of those were external, like population data, internet search data, you name it, a lot of data sources. And then within that, using machine learning to identify millions of possible connections between the data sources and the volume target forecast they were seeking, and down selected to 10 data sources that were found to be most statistically predictive of demand, and built a model with that. So as a result of this analytics approach, near-term forecasting actually went up by 35%, even 50% on some key lanes that were highly variable before. And that model allowed for earlier prediction of demand spikes and more flexible reallocation of capacity across the network to meet the areas that were attractive in terms of providing the right price. I think the one thing I'll mention here before moving on is there's a consistent theme across this case study and others we'll mention that analytics are really key to doing this right. This Spark Beyond model here was used for volume and very successful at that, but it could also be used for other efforts on retention, on recruiting, on scheduling, which we can talk about later. So our next case study, Megan, is on the second step in the process, planning the capacity. And if we recall, even once you know what your volume of work coming in is going to be, you need to understand how many people I need to deliver that work in a cost-effective way. So this case study was with the top public transport operator in the U.S. And their problem was that they were quite poor at planning the workforce they needed to deliver their projects. They had very long, expensive, complicated capital projects that were consistently falling behind schedule due to workload issues as well as going above cost. So their HR team needed some analytics to tell them how many positions would be needed, when, and so they could plan for hiring. So the approach here was twofold on the two types of staff. So within their capital delivery staff, they looked at the different types of projects that were available, right? 70+, so getting very granular with the number of capital projects out there, and used a combination of interviews as well as past timesheet data to show staffing needs, and forecasted staffing based on projected schedules future years. Within the operations staff, here again, getting very specific in terms of the types of support required, diversion, bus drivers, supervisors, you name it, using actual data from the field from past similar projects, and applied those forecasts for resourcing needs across the project schedules and highlighted gaps. This was integrated into a model that could be very flexible in case the project timeline or scope changed, to quickly flag for the HR team which work was required. So the result of this was as I mentioned, a dynamic model to predict workforce needs by quarter to deliver that capital spend, and highlighting roles that would be bottlenecks and when they would be, so that HR could get ahead of the problem and resolve it, and avoid the project delays and cost overruns that had happened before. Our third case study, if we get to Megan, is on the HR analytics for attracting and retaining talent, as I mentioned earlier. This is a really unique case study from trucking. So, as you likely know, driver attrition in the trucking space has been very high recently for a variety of reasons, many of which are not so well understood. And what that has resulted in is rapid turnover and high training and recruiting costs for trucking companies, as well as the low ability to capitalize on the commercial opportunities. There are many trucking companies see an opportunity to get new business and don't have the drivers of the requisite skill sets and passions to go capture those opportunities. The driver base, of course, is shrinking, and shipping demand is increasing, only more so after COVID, and so this problem is becoming more and more important. So this case study was an end-to-end analytics effort for a trucking company that started with analyzing 5 million or more data points from a bunch of different data sources. As you see here, these are from across the organization, then supplemented with a health and people analytics retention survey and feedback from drivers throughout the network. This was integrated into a model that combined a number of these variables to understand cause and effect dynamics. And the point of this was to do a few things. First, to understand what are the real causes of attrition, as opposed to what was said. For instance, often it's said it's just raw pay. Sometimes that's the case, but it could be very different things. It could be relationships with a manager at a terminal. It could be age difference between an employee and other employees, or between them and their manager. It could be the quality of the vehicle they drive. It could be the frequency of their pay, or perceived fairness in route allocation, many other things. And with that work, flagging what those causes of attrition could be, we're able to identify 5 clusters of drivers at risk, and then that allowed the client to target their intervention efforts to each cluster. The result of this, of course, is you see big improvements on the right. 6 targeted initiatives to unlock the opportunity with levers like I described, and benefits for 20% improvement in new driver retention, 30% increase in new hires, which allowed them to get more revenue, and about $10 million in yearly savings in recruiting costs, plus driver performance. That's often something that's forgotten. We think about the cost of training and onboarding new employees, which is very true, but we often don't think about the better performance from those employees. In the case of truck drivers, for instance, it could mean fewer accidents, or lower repair costs, or lower vehicle downtime for the equipment they drive. And last case study we'll talk about here is on scheduling resources for an airline. So this is, once you have the people you need, planning their work schedules against the demand needs. In the case of an airline, of course, demand is highly variable throughout the day. It may not be in some other support functions, your finance and IT functions. But in the case of frontline employees, we'll see here, it is highly variable. So in this case, we saw a major international airline. It had one large hub. Unfortunately, its labor force had quite low productivity because schedules were not flexible and they were highly variable. So they were looking to improve productivity and ideally minimize disruption to their workforce. To do this, started by building a staffing insights model. And this is a consistent theme I think we'll hear, is that now analytics is really a key driver of the workforce improvement, the workforce management improvements that we're talking about throughout this session. And from that staffing insights model, identified sources of value based on ideas that the airline itself come up from, as well as past Mckinsey experience and case studies like mentioned before, and resulted in a variety of savings levers that were tested on the schedule by modifying employee work rules like shift timing, number at work at any certain time, and running different scenarios for volume peaks and troughs to make sure there's robustness in the schedule. So coming out of that, of course, was a set of savings levers identified to reduce costs by up to 30%, which is quite significant for this airline. And the best news was that this all happened with very limited disruptions to the labor force. So it proves, as we're about to transition to our next chapter, at least thinking ahead, there's often this thought that it's a cost versus service trade-off. Often it's not, though, unless you're at the efficiency frontier and you are truly getting the most out of your workforce. There's often opportunities to reduce costs without challenging service. So with that, Julian, I'll toss it back to you for our third section agenda.
Thank you, Andrew. So let's now talk about how to get the value. If you go to page 16, the question is how, like Andrew talked to the different cases in terms of showing that there is tremendous impact if you apply workforce management excellence. But the question is, how can you capture this value? And if you go here on the left-hand side, I think we believe it's very important that it is a trade-off between three elements. It is people, business processes, and technology. And what we really mean by that, it's not that technology alone can solve this problem. Because in transport and logistics, labor is quite important, and it's important to understand the underlying business processes. It's important to understand the restrictions, sometimes in terms of unions, but other stakeholders, to take this into consideration, and then see how technology can help here to answer and find the right solution. But it's quite important to not say technology can answer it, only people can solve it, or we can just refine the business processes. But we fundamentally believe it's important to answer key questions along these three dimensions and find the right trade-off. And if you go to the right-hand side, we really think it needs to start with answering 7 design questions along these 3 elements to get started, rather than directly jumping into implementation. And if you go to the bottom right-hand side and start with the business processes, it really starts with saying, what is your target? In the sense of, like, what is the right trade-off in terms of cost and quality? Because the higher the service levels, the less flexibility you have, and therefore it needs to be an important discussion between the commercial, the operational team, to say where do we start from? What is our objective function? Then the second question is really, how does this continuous planning cycle that Andrew just walked us through, how does it look like for your company? So what are the different steps? What are the different players? And what are really the intersections? And then the third step is really saying, like, what is the status quo, how we do it, but pinpoint the inefficiencies and say, how can we optimize it? These are the key questions on the business process side. And then when we go once up to the technology, the question really is, in how far do the IT interfaces at the moment really underpin this continuous cycle? How do they help, and where are the breakpoints? And secondly, what are really the use cases and what is the value behind it, rather than thinking that one end-to-end complex technology can solve everything. We believe it is fundamentally important to look at the end-to-end cycle and think, what are the use cases and maybe this IT solution that can help you to unlock it. For example, like as Andrew talked through, to really have better demand forecasting with advanced analytics, or maybe have a software to do better demand and supply matching and do this in shorter iterations and be very flexible in terms of how you adjust it if there are changes to the demand side. But really link it to a concrete use case along the cycle. It's quite important. And then lastly, if you go up and we talk about people, it is really the performance management. So number one, how can we really measure, but at the same time, how can we incentivize the frontline people, which is quite important in typical, very fragmented businesses that we see in transport and logistics. And then lastly, if you don't get alignment within the organization across the different functions, but at the same time external with the key stakeholders like unions, like governments, you sometimes cannot implement very great plans. So these are very important that these design questions are answered, before jumping into it, because otherwise we see that you cannot unlock the value. If you then go to the next page and think about how can you get started, we often see typical challenges. Challenge number one that you see here is limited data transparency. So the typical question, what is really the productivity? Like typically we see numbers, but they're always averages of averages, but we don't really understand what is the frontline productivity in certain sites compared to others, and what is really the utilization that we have. What is the skill level that we have, and what are really the labor costs, and how do they really differ across the year, across the months, across different shifts that you have? So really have a fact base to have this discussion. These are the things that are typically missing. Secondly, we see fragmented tool landscapes, not even within the whole company, but even across business units. So there are different tools or Excel models that have been applied over the years, and it's not absolutely clear, like, how this landscape looks like. So it's quite important to get a baseline and understand what is applied currently, what are the challenges, and how can you standardize to really get the most out of it. The last one is really, which links a little bit to this one, is thinking about and how far can you standardize and support centrally. In the end, workforce management needs to be driven decentral, because typically it's in defragmented business, and therefore it's important that the sites are kind of governing kind of the key decisions. But it's important to get central support and central excellence to use tools effectively to drive excellence. And lastly, doesn't matter how good the tool is or good your forecasting is, if you don't have the flexibility in your workforce in terms of part-time, temp labor, and then you don't have the right mix to really have the flexibility, you cannot get out the value. So it's also quite important to think about what is the current flexibility you have and what are new methods that you can use to increase the flexibility in the medium, but also in the short term. And I think here it is kind of about get started and think about how can you address these challenges. So, for example, limited transparency should not hold you back, but you need to think about how you can create a fact base. The fragmented tool landscape is a challenge, but you need to get started to see how can you build and use what you have, and think in how far maybe one tool and one business unit can be applied to other, because that's not always the case. And at the same time, really involve kind of cross-functional, like the HR team in terms of thinking about the labor models you have, involve the commercial teams about thinking about the quality of the forecast, but also how operations actually uses this forecast, and ensure that you don't lose inefficiencies because the teams are not working efficiently together. These are typical pain points that we see, and we think addressing these and answering the 7 design questions will help you to unlock tremendous value. And if you now go to the last slide before opening for Q&A, there are 3 questions that we want to leave with you. The first question is the overall question: do you have an ambitious strategy to unlock value with your workforce management strategy? Have you answered this? Do you have an answer to these 7 questions? And when we specifically look into these 3 elements, the first question on business processes is obviously in how far will this business process look fundamentally different in the new normal? Secondly, on the technology, the question is how good are your current solutions? And do you really have a clear understanding of the use case and the value that the new solutions can bring you within the end-to-end cycle, rather than believing that technology alone can solve everything? And lastly, is the question about the new working model. How does it look like in the new normal? Do you have an answer more kind of in the medium and long term? These are the 3 questions that the 4 questions that we want to leave with you and things that belong on your agenda. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, everyone. As a reminder, please enter questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. All questions will be anonymous and not attributed to you. I'll kick it off with our first question for Julian. For companies who are just beginning their workforce analytics journey, what are the common pitfalls you've seen across other companies that they should avoid for workforce management?
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, so a very important question. I believe there are 3 things, and I alluded to them a little bit. I think the first one is really just get started. I think sometimes, specifically in the transport and logistics industry, it is overwhelming that the data transparency sometimes is not as good, and it's a relatively fragmented business. But it's really important to get started and use the data that is available and try to make it as fact-based as possible and measure to get started. It doesn't need to be perfect. Imperfect is okay. I think this would be one. I think the second one is really about this cross-functional approach. So quite often I have seen kind of like a operational driven approach to improve kind of workforce management, or maybe focusing on certain sites. But I think it is very important to have kind of the executive commitment and kind of say we approach this together as one team, the commercial, operations, and HR, to try to really think how we can improve the end-to-end cycle. And lastly, I think it is about the technology. I think technology is one key component in unlocking the value, but it's not the only one. And you should not start and think that technology will just solve this, but it's fundamentally important, specifically in transport and logistics, to start with the processes and think about the stakeholders and people involved to really unlock the value. So these would be my 3 lessons learned to get going.
Thank you, Julian. I'll send our next question to Andrew. Andrew, given the situation we're in right now with COVID-19 and the tight labor market, the importance of retention is so clear. Could you elaborate on the case study you shared, or a separate case study, on where companies should start to identify the sources of attrition and opportunities for retention?
Sure. As I mentioned before, this is a common problem for just about every company, but especially in this industry. And it's one that, because executives think about it frequently, there often are ideas they've got in their head and that people on the front line have. And often the retention efforts start out with a preconceived notion of what the answer is, and then they just go try to make it happen. Often, unfortunately, that answer is very expensive. It's, give people a bigger bonus to stay 6 months or a year, or increase the pay, which can be good sometimes, but often it's expensive. What we did in the case I mentioned, as well as several others through our people analytics work, is to include those hypotheses in what we test, but many other hypotheses and many other data sets in what's being tested in the model up front, without a preconceived notion of what the answer is going to be, so that through the advanced analytics work, we can uncover that real answer, those few answers, and the archetypes of employees who are at risk. That way, we can be sure that the levers that come out are truly the most impactful. Also, that allows a healthy discussion amongst the group on the set of improvement levers that come out of the analytics model in terms of which to prioritize and which not. The model can tell you what it thinks is going to move the needle on retaining more employees or recruiting more employees, but it can't necessarily tell you what's most in line with your company culture or most cost effective. And so there is room for discussion as a group, as leaders, to debate among various ideas, to rank them in terms of the cost, the impact, the feasibility, and then move forward in a targeted manner. But it's helpful to use the model first, to make sure you uncover all those ideas before you have the conversations to down select into a few. And when that's done, it's proven to be pretty successful.
Thank you, Andrew. Julian, if we go back to you, one of the challenges you alluded to with workforce management is this idea, the necessity of workforce flexibility. Given that so many companies in this industry are unionized, what have you seen companies do to achieve more flexibility for workforce management?
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely right that there are constraints that need to be taken into consideration. I mean, for me, first step is always developing the right mix without the constraints. So having a very clear perspective in terms of the demand and the supply and the right kind of what would be optimal for you before going then into the discussion with the stakeholders. Obviously, with the stakeholders, there's then kind of like a trade-off decision that you need to take into consideration what is best for the employee in terms of like maybe there's overtime, but you can like incentivize certain overtimes, but you can do overtimes during the peak time, but therefore you have a little bit less work during times when there's not so much demand going on. So I think for me, the lesson learned is number one, you need to have a perspective. What is the target labor mix that you aspire? Secondly, I think you need to work collaboratively with the different stakeholders to really show the value, but also the inefficiencies if you don't have the right model, which leads into underutilization and could also lead to frustration for the workforce. So just make it transparent and try to take the stakeholders along the line. And then secondly, thirdly, kind of think how can you kind of implement this in a way that it's best for the employees and also for the union. So I think, as I said, it's like a collaborative approach that you need to apply to it. But you need to have an own perspective. You need to collaborate and need to then kind of define the target state.
Thanks, Julian. Another question coming in is around, I'll send this to Andrew. When you look across companies you've seen do workforce management well, what are the top 2 to 3 characteristics you see of high-performing teams who are getting this right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say there are 3 characteristics. One is that they're planning end-to-end. So they follow this process for their own variant of the process we described, end-to-end, considering implication of each step on all the subsequent steps and all the prior steps, and not siloed efforts. Second is that it's cross-functional. Sometimes a workforce can just be led by, say, HR, and they do their best, but if they don't have the support of the rest of the organization, it's not going to be successful. And third is that they're highly analytical. Rules of thumb are great places to start, but often those lead to organizations getting stuck in a suboptimal solution. So to those points, one by one, the silo mentality can be very problematic if a organization is determining, say, staffing levels based solely on their own ability to deliver the work they need to deliver and not, any implication on cost or hiring needs, let's say. Or if hiring is just based on some flat approval to hire a certain number of people at a certain time and not when demand's actually likely to come in. So there can be real imperfections if that's not done in an integrated way. The idea of thinking about workforce management in such an integrated way is, in many cases, relatively new. But we are seeing more and more companies start to think that way, and that's very promising for their performance in workforce management. That really comes hand in hand with being cross-functional. It should, at least. It doesn't always. Sometimes HR or another frontline organization is given the task of handling workforce management broadly across all the steps, but without the power to do that. That used to be more common, I'd say. It's a little bit less common from what I've seen, but it's set up for failure if an organization, if the body within the organization responsible for delivering the results doesn't have the tools to make it happen. And then lastly, analytics, of course, important. I think we've beaten that drum many times today, but it really helps knock down assumptions and prove out what really matters to an organization in terms of, say, which employees does it matter the most to have a buffer of to deliver service, or what kind of service do customers really care about, or how unpredictable really is their demand during peaks. Analytics can help clarify and show the answer to things that often have just been gut feelings from senior leaders in an organization whom the rest of the organization are unwilling to challenge.
Thank you, Andrew. Julian, we have another question coming in related to the shock of COVID-19. What are some of the better examples you've seen of companies updating their demand forecast in response to the demand surge and responding with short-term capacity planning?
So the question is how to manage demand and supply during the COVID crisis where demand is going through the roof.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a very important and fundamental question. And I think I can just play back kind of a couple of lessons learned or best practices that I have seen that were quite effective across different industries, specifically in logistics, postal and the parcel industry. I think the one is really setting up the central task force that works really agile in the way that you have kind of this daily meetings and daily huddles where you kind of say, what is the current situation? Because you cannot plan that easily in this situation because every day can look differently and there are new informations and the parcel volume sometimes goes up significantly from week to week. So it's very important to have this centralized agile task force mentality and think about, okay, what is the problem today and not kind of saying we develop one plan and then we follow this plan. I think that's one. I think the second is really thinking end to end. So quite often in logistics, it is about the operations is taking a certain site or one step in the value chain and thinking what is the best answer there. But the question really is what are the levers within operations to get additional capacity, like working overtime or getting additional temp labor people to support, but also thinking from a network view to think how one side can support the other side. How can this be done? And then also thinking really about the customer and working with the top 10 customers and say, how can we do calls with them and discuss, maybe there are different drop-off locations, maybe there are certain days that are not that important, how can we make this more flexible? So really thinking end-to-end, working with the customer, having a network view rather than doing a side-to-side optimization. This proved very important in terms of getting the additional capacity or working with even additional problems of reduced capacity through the new regulations or requirements during the lockdown. Then the third thing that I've seen is really about how can you incentivize the workforce. So typically, quite often in e-commerce, the peak time is the one where there's so much stress. But this year it's peak over peak. So you basically almost have the peak all over the year. And the question is, how can you incentivize them in terms of peak bonuses, or how can executives kind of make a statement and support and give kind of the appreciation to the blue collar workers that really do the heavy lifting during the time that we already have seen and the time that we are running into now. And the last one is really also the stakeholder management. Because, I mean, sometimes there are certain breakpoints where it's not possible to deliver certain volume anymore, and there are certain delays, and it's important to just be transparent and communicate to the key stakeholders that there's correct expectation management. So these would be 4 observations from my side in terms of what has good companies done to handle this effectively.
Very helpful. Thank you, Julian. The next question, we'll start with Andrew, but I think it's relevant for both Andrew and Julian. There's a question around what are the different challenges faced within subsectors of the transportation and logistics industry? Andrew, could you start with the sectors that you're most familiar with?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the ones I'm most familiar with are in the trucking, third-party logistics, freight forwarding, that space, as well as air and ground network travel. First, within trucking and logistics, the biggest challenge has recently been in the driver space. Maintenance employees is important. It is important to get the right people, of course, but there appears to have been less of shortage, I'd say, in that area. And so while companies are always looking to hire the right folks within maintenance, and there's organizational culture and commitment to quality and safety and efficiency, work to be done there. I would say from my observations of trucking and logistics players, the frontline staff in terms of drivers is most challenging. Of course, you have some companies that are, your freight brokers and others who are asset light, and so it's a bit of a less relevant problem to them. But for the trucking companies, it's all the things I mentioned above in terms of retention, but retention at an affordable cost of trucking truckers. And particularly, we've noticed a trend that it used to be that drivers were fine with being out on the road for a long period of time without being home as much. That's changed in recent years, but the demand hasn't as much. And so there's a real targeted type of employee that's very hard to get, especially in an affordable way. And so companies are struggling with how to get those employees, how to keep them without spending too much. Within the air and ground travel world, I'd say it's also frontline employees. So that depends. Like terminal staff are very important as well. Of course, all of this is impacted by COVID, shaken up a bit, and so we'll have to see exactly where it falls out. But for instance, in the airlines, there's been a pilot shortage due to some of the dynamics of that market, and so getting the right pilots, flight attendants, let's say, bus drivers, has been a real challenge. So the recruiting and retention part is quite significant, and one that a lot of companies haven't wrapped their head around as well as they have in terms of scheduling resources and other challenges like that. Julian, do you want to cover some other sectors?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. Maybe let me talk about the post and parcel industry. There are obviously quite some overlaps to Andrew, but I think for me there are three things that stand out. I mean, number one, really driven by the e-commerce, importance of e-commerce, the fluctuation of demand has increased significantly. And so the question is really how to get an accurate forecast of demand on the local level, given that typically the network is quite fragmented. And while on the global level, so on the country level, the forecasts are getting better and better, the question is really how can you get to an accurate forecast on the local level and match demand and supply to not have too many overcapacities. I think this is one challenge. And now with kind of advanced analytics, you can approach this more easily, but at the same time, this is still fundamentally a challenge that needs to be solved. Secondly, is the question about HR analytics linked to absenteeism and attrition. So 5 to 10% absenteeism rates are not rare in the post and parcel industry. And the question is really, especially now with like parcels getting more important than letters, and parcels obviously much more difficult to handle in terms of like workload and also in terms of like how heavy the parcels are, and it's much more complicated to deliver. The question is a little bit, how do you use soft factors and other factors to keep the workforce, to motivate the workforce, and really understand the drivers of absenteeism, but also to retain and attract the right talent that you need in the right place. That's a fundamental challenge, and it's important to put focus on it, but at the same time use analytics to find the right answers and not go in with kind of things that you think are right, but try to use data to guide the answer. And then lastly, we talked about this, is really about the labor flexibility, which is indeed a challenge in industry, which is unionized and it has constraints. But as I said, I think number one, it's important to understand what is the right mix for you and what really gives you value, and then start the collaborative approach to do it, to make a change. But this is the kind of a tit for tat, and it's quite important to have an own perspective and then work with the stakeholders to get more flexibility, which sometimes can also be a win-to-win, and this is important to drive power.
Thanks, Julian. Given that we only have a few minutes left, we'll end on a future-looking question. Julian, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that short-term and medium-term workforce management goes hand in hand with thinking about the long-term future of work with regards to what the workforce look like. Can you tell us more about what the interaction is between workforce management and future of work?
Sure. I mean, obviously there are intersections, but I think on the future of work, it's really thinking about how does technology and other structural changes fundamentally change the supply that you need in the future. So when you think about technology, if you would have autonomous trucks, if you have like drones or autonomous vehicles delivering the parcels, then you need kind of a different workforce, or you need different people, less people, or maybe different skill sets to deliver certain pieces. So it's really about thinking in the long term how technology can drive a fundamental change and thinking about scenarios. But obviously, these changes can happen kind of also in the near term. So I think it's important to do both. So on the one hand, have the long-term view and thinking about what are the technologies that really can drive or disrupt changes that in terms of what you need. I mean, COVID also had an impact, like how you think about on-site and not on-site kind of workforce, which is obviously on the blue collar not as much affected as the white collar. But then in the short term, it's more about within the constraints, how I can optimize it. But I think the more you think about the scenarios and the technology, then you can also use it to your advantage. So I think both is quite important, but the one is more long-term thinking about less constraints, and the other one starting with the status quo and then layering in new innovations that you can use to drive a step change.
Excellent. Thank you, Julian. Andrew, Julian, any closing thoughts on what you're excited about in this space, both for for companies you work with?
So I think workforce is, sorry, Andrew, go.
No, I'd say it's a really exciting topic, and COVID has only made it a more important and ever-changing topic, and so happy to get in conversations with anyone after the fact.
Yes, I agree. And fundamentally, in the short and medium term, labor will continue to stay very important and is very important in transport logistics. And therefore, I fundamentally believe that this is a very important topic to not only drive service levels, but employee satisfaction and cost. So very excited to have any discussions after this session. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining today.